week was definitely the mostly ridiculous fashion at the Met Gala. You had some people wear full-body masks. I don't know what that was about. And then you had a lot of people who made political statements. People didn't really pay attention to the political statement I made at the Met Gala, which is unfortunate since I worked with a fancy designer who shall remain nameless to come up with this masterpiece. I know, it really accentuated all my curves, and I think this message will really move this crowd. Before we start, please hit that subscribe button below and like this video. The Biden administration declassified an FBI report that was written 5 years ago that looked into the 9/11 hijackers and their ties to Saudi diplomats living in the US. Not a lot of people covered this, which I think is crazy, because the report says something different than what the 9/11 Commission report said back in 2004, and it has the potential to become a big deal. The 2004 report wrote about these two Saudi diplomats who both left the US 3 weeks before the attacks. And the old report said that these guys knew the hijackers but didn't actively support them or deliberately meet with them. But this FBI report kind of flips the whole thing around, since they found evidence not only that the Saudi diplomats supported the hijackers and helped them settle here, but that one encounter in particular was not coincidence. The report also found that these diplomats in general were super sketch, since they were both in touch with other terrorists who were plotting attacks against the United States. Now, the report does not link the Saudi government on the whole to the 9/11 attacks, but a lawyer representing families who are suing the Saudi government sees it differently and argues that this is proof that the Saudi government actively knew of al-Qaeda's activity here. Now, the Saudis deny any involvement in 9/11, and their embassy said it supports the declassification of these reports because they believe it'll clear their name. Here's the thing that's tricky. Whether or not the Saudi government supported al-Qaeda's activity here, it's still their responsibility to ensure that the diplomats and military officials they send here aren't plotting terrorist attacks. That's not how diplomacy works. Now, Biden will be releasing additional reports, and depending on how this lawsuit unfolds, and if these diplomats are charged or sentenced, it could end up driving an even larger wedge between the US and Saudi governments. North Korea is making some interesting fashion statements lately. First, they held a military parade where soldiers marched in orange hazmat suits and gas masks, I think so that they could convey a message that they're fighting the pandemic with nuclear weapons. And then you had Kim Jong-un showing off his body. I mean, look at him. He's thin and tan, and he looks like he just came back from a spa weekend with the girls. And he's wearing a tan suit. I asked you all if you thought it was the real Kim Jong-un, and 87% of you said no. Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that. I think the chubby pasty version is hiding somewhere eating cake. Usually these military parades are done to shore up domestic support, especially in difficult times, which North Korea is going through right now. They shut down their borders in January of 2020, even to trade with China in order to keep the virus out. Word has it they consulted Nicki Minaj on this decision. But now North Korea is facing major food shortages and a really bad economy. And this is important because it explains Kim Jong-un's behavior. On one hand, he wants to show his people that he's starving along with them. And on the other, he's looking for opportunities to appear strong, which explains the military parade and North Korea's move this week to launch 2 long-range ballistic missiles. On the same day, the South Koreans launched a ballistic missile from a submarine to deter North Korea from doing anything. So now you have 2 problems. First, the North Koreans are suffering, and with the borders closed, there's not a lot we or aid organizations can do to get food and medicine into the country. And the second is that even though Kim Jong-un is doing all this for pomp and circumstance, you now have an arms race in the Korean peninsula. So we have to make sure that things there don't escalate. A senior military leader in Guinea has overthrown the government there, and if past coups have taught us anything, it's that they rarely bring stability. The former president is a corrupt and autocratic human rights abuser who had previously faced opposition when he drafted a new constitution that would allow him to stay in office past the country's 2-term limit. And when people in Guinea protested this, the government responded with violence and arrests. In fact, people have been killed in protests during each of the president's 3 elections. Now, before you jump in the air and say, okay, great, he's gone, the new guy is a senior military officer who's been threatened with sanctions for alleged human rights abuses. And 9 out of 10 times, things usually end up worse when a military takes over this way. The thing is, things in Guinea have been brewing for a while, and since the country has major natural resources, the world kind of ignored what was going on there. So I brought on my friend Jeffrey Smith, who's the founding director of the pro-democracy nonprofit Vanguard Africa, and he just co-authored a piece where he explains how by governments ignoring the situation, not only did the world undermine democracy and work against Guinea's people, but they may have ushered in the very instability they were hoping to prevent. Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for joining the show. I'm so excited to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Listen, I found your piece fascinating because you talked about people turning a blind eye to this major situation and the consequences of that. At Oh My World, we talk about that all the time, why people need to pay attention. What do you think is going to happen in Guinea now? Can you talk to us about this guy and what's in store for the future?
Yeah, great questions. Well, Mamadi Doumbouya is a young Cavalier colonel. He was a member of Guinea's elite special forces. He was also a former French legionnaire. He's also very young. He's 41 years old, same age as me, coincidentally. So he's almost exactly half the age of the president he just ousted, who is 83. Since seizing power on September 5, he has promised to establish what he's called a government of national union. And he's promised to transition away from the former president's increasingly autocratic and corrupt rule. Importantly, while the coup was greeted with expected scorn by regional and international leaders, those same leaders, interestingly, who turned a blind eye to the former regime's abuses, we saw a very different reaction on the ground. By and large, Ghanaians took to the streets, not in protest, but actual celebration, following the ouster of what they saw as a very oppressive regime that violated human rights, trampled on the Constitution, and violently rigged elections. This optimism, however, it's going to be short-lived. Military power grabs almost inevitably result in more brutal systems of governance than the ones they replaced. Guinea's two other coups since achieving independence in 1950 have actually shown this. And according to academic research, new authoritarian regimes often emerge after coups, along with higher levels of state-sanctioned violence. So even if Doumbouya's hostile takeover may have dealt with the immediate danger of the Condé regime, the former regime, it will almost certainly generate longer-term negative consequences. And this could include instability, international isolation, and unfortunately, the same sorts of human rights abuses and economic hardship that Ghanaians have become so accustomed to in recent years.
It's just terrible. And so, which gets me to my next point, actually, which is why should Americans care, right? Why should we care about what's happening in Guinea or in other parts of Africa where you're also seeing a lot of these types of coups?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, Americans and those watching this program especially should care about the situation in Guinea, because the sort of democratic backsliding and the massive erosion we have seen there, the deplorable conditions, for example, that provided pretext for this month's coup, this is a global phenomenon. In other words, the erosion of democracy over there and what we're experiencing over here, these aren't mutually exclusive issues or situations. This is all related, and it really demands urgency. It demands solidarity across borders to push back and protect our human rights and the personal freedoms that are clearly under sustained assault. Relatedly, going back to the Ghanaians being quick to embrace their new leaders, albeit those clad in military fatigues, they have done this, unsurprisingly, instead of placing their hopes in regional and international communities whose leaders often espouse democratic principles, but rarely stand up to defend them. So the time for hollow statements needs to be over. The situation in Guinea and in other countries where democratic foundations are constantly being rocked demands action. This includes, for example, sanctions on leaders who rig elections or force through changes to the Constitution to extend their power, which we saw in Guinea. This means not recognizing farcical elections and the illegitimate governments that they ultimately produce. And this also entails diplomatic red lines and real consequences for undemocratic leaders, including visa and travel restrictions and seizing the global assets of those leaders. And for me, put simply, we must walk the talk. And that just hasn't happened up until now.
Right. It doesn't portend a good future. Well, listen, I'm with you. I hope I see more reaction from the international community and bodies and governments. Well, we'll see. We'll have to see what happens. All right.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
You know how Iran's nuclear facilities are inspected by a UN agency? So every few months, the UN's atomic agency, which is called the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, sends inspectors to make sure all nuclear material is for peaceful use only. Well, it turns out that Iranian male security guards at one of these facilities have physically harassed several female UN inspectors over the last few months. I'm gonna file that under what not to do when you're trying to prove to the world that you aren't up to bad behavior. The incidents included inappropriate touching of female inspectors and orders to remove some of their clothing. As if that wasn't bad enough, some diplomats are worried that by publicly disclosing these incidents, the relationship between the IAEA and Iran could sour, which could affect future access to these nuclear sites. Yeah, because hiding this kind of behavior and kissing Iran's ass has always worked. While we're on the subject of Iran's nuclear program, I figured I'd wave a big red flag since Iran has enriched almost enough nuclear material to fuel a nuclear weapon, and that crosses a new milestone for them and increases pressure on the US to make a new deal. The IAEA has also accused Iran of failing to cooperate with investigations and refusing access to some of its nuclear sites. So things are really looking up on that front. Between the Iranian government's nuclear activity and these male security guards, they're all on my list this week. A lot of you have been asking how you can help Afghans, so I thought I'd share the work of two organizations I'm totally crushing on. First is called No One Left Behind, which is dedicated to supporting the interpreters our government and military have used in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as you can imagine, those interpreters put their lives on the line to help us out, and they're often targeted and killed for doing this kind of work. So this organization, which is made up of all volunteers, helps these individuals apply for visas, resettle in the United States, and even get jobs, and they're actively working to help Afghans now. The other organization that's crushing it is an Italian NGO called Emergency, which provides free, high-quality healthcare to victims of war, poverty, and landmines. And they also help build hospitals and train local staff. One of the things I love about this organization is that they have this cool and totally awesome philosophy where they argue that the right to be treated is a fundamental and inalienable. Let's start over. One of the things I love about this organization is that they have this cool and totally awesome philosophy where they argue that the right to be treated is a fundamental and inalienable right. They've worked in 19 countries and treated over 11 million people. And in Afghanistan alone, they've treated 7.5 million patients since 1999. And they continue to provide healthcare to Afghans even after the collapse. If you want to learn more about these nonprofits or give a donation, visit nooneleft.org and en.emergency.it. Thanks, geeks! I have a really cool thing I'll be announcing next week, so keep your geeky eyes and ears peeled. Before you go, please hit that subscribe button below and like this video. And if you have any questions, feedback, or stories you want me to talk about, I will obviously give you a shout out, so please leave a comment or reach out to me directly on the socials. Stay geeky and stay fabulous.